few announcements before. If you're interested in helping with VBS, be here tonight at 5:15. VBS will be June 5th through the 7th. On Saturday, May 3rd, Amy Wam's sponsoring a tea party. It's going to be from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. It's going to raise money for missions. There's 2 sign-up sheets on the bulletin board. One is if you want to attend. The other is if you'd like to decorate a table. And we'll be having a silent auction, so you can donate anything, and you see Miss Becky Godwin for that. And the deadline to sign up is April 27th. And then we also have family night this Wednesday, April 9th at 6:15. Adult One serving. So for anybody listening from Adult One, I will send out a message and we'll get that together. And then also there will be a children's trip to go see the movie King of Kings. I think most who would want to go have responded in here. But if anybody else, any other children want to go, we do have some extra tickets. And so I will communicate about what time we'll be leaving and all that. Alrighty. So... Oh, no. Okay. All right. I'll be reading today. Alrighty. So let me get to where I'm supposed to be. Okay. Page 70. So we're still in the sections about signs. And so this week we will be discussing Jesus' sign of his light. And so I guess I'll be reading this week everything. So I will start with the Bible Meets Life. It says, YouTube star Mr. Beast surprised 1,000 people with free cataract surgery that cured their blindness. Because of his generosity, previously blind people found eyesight. In Jesus' day, such procedures weren't available. He healed one man's blindness with a simple mixture of saliva and dirt. Some look at disability as a hindrance. Others see it as just experiencing the world differently. In today's session, we'll see a blind man who was hindered not by himself, but by the society in which he lived. Imagine how this man's entire world changed when his eyes were open and he encountered the light of the world. And so we are talking about, we've all probably heard this story many times about Jesus healing the blind man. And he says the very famous line that we all talk about when we sing Amazing Grace. Once I was blind, now I see. And he said that's one of, those things. But really, what we're talking about is not just the physical light that he saw, but of his spiritual awakening, that he saw Jesus as the light of the world. And so we are still in John. And just remember, John often doesn't get into like the specifics of what exactly happened. What he wants us to take away from what he's saying is who Jesus was and what he did. And so a lot of times there's a lot of questions that we may have as just, inquiring minds. But John doesn't often answer those questions because that's not what's important. So we're in John 9, and the first verses are 1 through 5. So it says, as he was passing by, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus answered. This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. We must do the works of him who sent me while it is today. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So this kind of comes by Jesus. This is coming at a time whenever Jesus is starting to be accused of things by the Pharisees. So he's starting to be accused of lying, having suicidal tendencies, being a Samaritan and a demon. And so the previous chapter was kind of filled with a bunch of conflict. And so Jesus is withdrawing. He's leaving where he was. And he may have been passing by an area of the temple where sick people sought alms and prayer. So back, I can't remember what section we were in, but we talked about when Jesus had the lame man go into the pool of water and he was healed and he was able to walk. I kind of envision this as that same area of the temple that, these people who really can't do anything for themselves just kind of hang out and seek something. But during this time, as they're kind of leaving the temple area, withdrawing from all of this conflict, he sees a blind man who's been blind since birth. So, close your eyes, you think you've never seen anything, which is hard for us to imagine, but that this guy, he's never seen ever. And so the first statement here, the first thing that's pointed out is that the disciples, they call Jesus rabbi, which means he's like their master or their teacher. And they're recognizing him as the authority. The disciples are seeing something that a lot of other people around them are not seeing, the Pharisees. And so they're following his teaching and his wisdom. But they ask this question of who sinned? Why, who sinned to make this man blind? And often back during this time, it was common to relate illness with sinful behavior, that they've done something and God is kind of punishing them with this illness. So they wondered if maybe it was the man's parents who were bearing this judgment. They've done something and so they've had a blind son. Or if it was the man himself, like what kind of sin did he do? However, he's been blind since birth, so what could he have done before birth that would make him blind? And so Jesus answers their question. He says that neither this man or his parents have sinned. He didn't teach that they were sinless. We're all human. They were human. They did have sins. However, this condition was not due to what he or his family are done or how they had disobeyed the Lord. There was Jesus had an entirely different rationale for why he was blind, and so he says that this gentleman is blind so that God's works might be displayed in him. And this can be interpreted several ways. Once again, John does not go into the specifics, but there's a couple of different ways that this passage can be interpreted, and neither of them are wrong. And so first of all, you may interpret it as this was God's pre-existing plan. It was for the man to have blindness so that years later, Jesus could heal him and demonstrate the power of God within him. So, they say God had this man to be born blind so that this miracle could happen. Others may suggest that he just kind of stepped in to a need which was really independent of God's pre-existent will and decided to show favor to him, decided that this was never really part of God's plan, but Jesus kind of made it part of that so that he could show God's works. However, we can conclude that the miracle of healing underscored the truth of Jesus' teaching in the preceding chapter and his statements later in this chapter about being the light of the world. Jesus demonstrated God's light that day through this miracle, and only the spiritually deficient religious leaders would fail to recognize it. So, as we read on, we'll see that the Pharisees, they had these they couldn't get past some of the laws that they had to see what was really going on here, that Jesus really was of God. And so, we're not so much worried about why God wanted to see this work or how this came about, more so that we were able to see this work and see that Jesus is the light of the world. And then he kind of gives a almost like we need to take the opportunity as it comes. He said, we must do the work of him who sent me while it is day. So there's almost like we need to go ahead and get this done. We need to be prompt about this. Jesus insisted that he must do God's work even in times of testing. So once again, Jesus is kind of trying to get out of this situation right now. There's a lot of conflict going on. He's being accused of a lot of things. There's a lot of tension in the air surrounding him. And he may only be escaping getting stoned by the Pharisees by a few moments. The Pharisees, as we know, and as you know, we know kind of how this ends. We're not finished with Jesus. They were targeting him for further attack. And so Jesus does this, kind of delay his departure at this point. And kind of and he demonstrates his commitment to compassion. So even at a time when he's being sought out, when he could be stoned or put in jail for something really that he had not done, he still delays his departure to show compassion to this gentleman, to display God's works. But he's also, we are learning from this that we must make it a priority to love and serve others despite adverse circumstances around us. And the reason for the promptness is that night is coming, and during this ancient world time, it was really kind of impossible to work as the normal day shut down, and they didn't have lights and things like we did. I mean, things got dark, and so the only light they had would come from the moon and the stars. So work really couldn't be done at nighttime. So he's saying we must be prompt about this. We must go ahead and take this opportunity to do God's work. He taught his disciples that, like him, they should do the works of God and do them promptly. And then he ends with a final statement, one of his I am statements that we see in John. And he says, I am the light of the world. So the night was coming. Opportunity will cease to be sure. Night can also look as danger or willful ignorance of humanity who chose to disobey God. So, we often look at sin and not obeying God. We'll talk about that as darkness. And so that's one of those kind of metaphors. Once again, night is coming. There is a darkness coming. Jesus is going to be hung from the cross. And so he's kind of, there's two things you can look at there. And so, but in contrast to that, Jesus bears the light of God's presence, love, and purpose. And we follow this light to find security and salvation. So whenever we follow God, when we follow Jesus, he can be that light for us in the darkness, which, even in today's world, there's a lot of darkness surrounding us, and Jesus continues to be that light for us. The blind man's story is widely known. He was a regular fixture outside the temple, begging for money. This was his only way to survive, since he seemed to have little familial or communal support. The disciples' question about the man was regarding the proximate cause of his suffering, but Jesus zoomed out to shine his light on the curse of sin that left the man both physically and spiritually blind. So in the next set of verses, we will see how Jesus not only opened this gentleman's eyes to see, but also can open our own. And so this will be John 6 through 11. So after Jesus said these things, he spit on the ground, made some mud from the saliva, and spread the mud on his eyes. Go, he told them, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. His neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit begging?" Some said, "He's the one." Others were like, "No, but he looks like him." He kept saying, "I am the one." Ooh, excuse me. So they asked him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So when I went and washed, I received my sight." So once again, this is a story that's quite familiar to us. But what we're seeing here is that as the light of the world, Jesus brought sight to a man born blind. He also brings sight to us. He brings light to us so that we can have salvation. So it talks about him spitting on the ground. And, some people believe that saliva had healing powers. But Jesus did not need medicine to show the power of God, nor did the pool of Siloam have any unique healing property. So really, this was just kind of a display. Jesus didn't really need to do all this to help this man become to be able to see. He didn't actually have to go to the pool and bathe. He could have just spoke words and the man would have been able to see. He probably could have just passed him by. He had the power of God. But, he did do this. It wasn't something that was necessarily unique. There have been other times when saliva has been used in the gospel for healing. So all of that was just kind of like maybe, as we'll talk about, maybe just something to show some faith. And so then he told this man to go wash. So he spread the mud on his eyes. He told him to go wash. And we don't know exactly how he washed. Once again, John's not into the details. There's no rationale given to why he spread the mud on his eyes and then told him to go wash. Maybe it was just to wash the mud off his eyes. We don't know. John doesn't go into that. However, regardless of Jesus' rationale for placing the mud on the blind man's eyes and sending him to Siloam Pool to wash off, the man's compliance resulted in his healing, and he came back seeing. So that's the important part. The important part is that this gentleman obeyed, and he came back and he saw. And there's a very similar story to this in the Old Testament with the prophet Elisha told Naaman of Syria to wash 7 times in the Jordan River, and what he was trying to get rid of was leprosy. And so Naaman kind of protested to this because he said the river was polluted, that his own country had better water in their rivers, but he did it anyway. He eventually agreed to the instruction, and his obedience brought cleansing from his leprosy. So we don't know for certain why this healing is delayed until these folks go and wash. What we do know is that in both cases, traveling to that water source indicated following through on instructions was showing an act of obedience and faith. So something we'll kind of see in a few minutes. This man didn't actually know who Jesus was at the time. He first calls him just a man called Jesus. He didn't know about his healing powers, but he still, followed through on this and showed that his act of obedience, his act of faith in this man who he really didn't know, healed him. And so I think in my mind, that's what it is. It's following through on these things that God asks us to do, even when we don't really feel like they make a whole lot of sense, or maybe we don't see the reason for them, or we're getting impatient. God is just asking us to have that obedience and that faith. So then his neighbors who had seen him before, they're puzzled now. There's this man who's been blind since birth. In this day and time, there's no fixing that. You're just blind until you die. There's no surgeries that they can do or fancy things that they can do to make somebody be able to see again. So they're puzzled. They're not really recognizing him. And they're questioning, is this the same man, or is it just somebody who looks like him? So, they're confused. And he says, I'm the one, that it's me. And he says, this man called Jesus healed me, or spread this mud on my eyes, told me to go wash, and when I washed, I received my sight. So he explained that Jesus had given him a strange command that, when followed, had brought about the presence of his sight. Presumably, his neighbors and acquaintances wanted to go and meet this man of miracles for themselves. I mean, would you not, if you had seen this, would you not want to go meet this person who had performed this miracle? Maybe then they themselves wanted to be healed of something. But you'll note, we're going to skip some verses here when we go on to the next set of verses, but there's a progression in this man's understanding. He's starting to figure out who this man really is who just healed him. First, he just calls him Jesus. And then, as the verses that they're going to skip, but in verse 17, he calls him a prophet. So he's starting to understand that this man might be from God, might be sent from God to heal me. So it says, Jesus could have healed this man's blindness in any number of ways. He could have spoken the word for the man's sight to return, but he chose to use saliva, often seen by ancients as having healing power, and dirt. Jesus had used saliva previously with other miraculous healings, but the dirt goes back to the book of Genesis and God's creation of humans out of the dust from the ground. Jesus has come to push back the darkness of sin and recreate what the enemy destroyed. Jesus is the one who opens our eyes to see. And then we can see as we move along that the work of Jesus really points to who he is, and that's John's whole purpose. John's purpose in in giving these stories is to point to who Jesus is, not the details, not, why this man was blind or how he went and washed. It's all about pointing to who Jesus is. And so you see here that we skip a lot of verses. We skip verses 12 through 29. So I read those, and a lot of it is just his neighbors brought this man to the Pharisees, and maybe they were wishing for some kind of like theological explanation from what they considered the religious elite. Remember, the Pharisees were considered religious people, so they brought him there, and then what they maybe wanted was the Pharisees to rejoice with them that the power of God was evident among them, that they're seeing the power of God. However, the response of the religious leaders was mixed, as we could probably expect. Some were distraught about the healing having taken place on the Sabbath. Once again, getting really mixed up in those laws, getting so ingrained in the details that they couldn't see the miracle that was in front of them. Others questioned how an evil man could have done such a remarkable act of healing, because remember, they think that he's, what did it say? That he was lying, that he had suicidal tendencies, that he was a demon. And then, having reached no conclusion on their own, they start interrogating this man about who was healed, about the exact circumstances of his healing. So that's kind of where we're at. They're just asking him a lot of questions about how he was healed and just all these questions. And then he finally says in verse 30, this is an amazing thing, like look at this. I mean, I've been blind since I was born, and now I can see. So he said, this is an amazing thing, the man told them. You don't know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. So the healed man describes his healing as amazing, and indeed it was. Surely, as it is probably to us, this miracle was really beyond the comprehension of this man who was healed, and beyond that of the Pharisees as well. Their hearts were hard. They tried to find a way to condemn Jesus rather than join in responding with all in rejoicing. So they were, he healed on the Sabbath. You shouldn't be doing that on the Sabbath. He's a demon, this is some kind of witchery. And so they can't, their hearts were so hard and they were so caught up in these laws that they could not see, past those things. They couldn't see what a miracle this was. And then the man says, you don't know where he's from. He was really becoming quite bold here, responding to the critical inquisitions of the Pharisees. They claimed they didn't know where Jesus was from, and the implication was that Jesus was a no-name teacher with no spiritual authority, a spiritual upstart without sanction. So once again, he's kind of impeding on their territory, and they don't know where this guy's from. You don't know what kind of things he does. You could never. Why? This is dangerous. And then. The blind man says, if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. And when he talks about God-fearing, and we all know this, it doesn't mean I'm afraid of God. It means I have reverence for God. It means I respect him. And he says God doesn't listen to sinners. His assertion was that it was impossible for Jesus to do miracle without God-ordained authority. The miracle he experienced demonstrated Jesus was a man of holiness. So he's saying this man has to be of God. He performed this miracle. This was God-ordained authority. This all came from God. So he's really starting to figure out that this man that came to him was this Messiah that had been spoken about. And when he talks about listening, he says that God doesn't hear sinners, but does hear those who have reverence for him. So in my mind, that statement is we're all sinners. However, we all have this reverence. We're God-fearing. And so God does listen to us. it says this observation came from the presumably unschooled, formerly blind man who now had an amazing spiritual insight. So this man who's not been able to go to school, who's really not been able to do anything for himself his whole life, is now having this amazing insight, this spiritual insight. So you can see that not only has he been healed physically, but now he's been healed spiritually as well. The Pharisees didn't know where Jesus came from or his spiritual pedigree. Their self-righteous and jealousy blinded them to the truth before them. The man who had been physically blind demonstrated he was not spiritually blind. He had a greater understanding than they did. He knew Jesus was, no doubt, a man sent from God to do the work of God. And so once again, that progression, it's this man named Jesus. He's a prophet. Now he says he's a man of God. He's from God. So whereas the healed man had previously identified Jesus as a man and then a prophet, he now concluded that Jesus had to be from God. A few verses on, he came to recognize and acknowledge that Jesus is Lord and worshiped him for who he is. This man's spiritual wisdom is inspired motivation for us to earnestly seek God in our lives and to bring our needs to him in prayer. So we know that this man didn't know much. He wasn't a scholar or a theologian, so he wasn't like these Pharisees who had had all this schooling. But he did know that once he was blind and now he could see. Their religious leaders, missing the miracle, quizzed the man about the origins of his restoration, and all he could provide was the evidence that his lifelong disease was cured. So it doesn't take us to be theologians or somebody who's just, like Mr. Josh, who can just quote things and, can pull out verses. All it takes is for us to share our own experience with what Christ has done in our lives. He understood the power of Christ and knew that such a profound miracle could only come from God. This is what salvation is like through Christ. We were once blind, but now we can see. We were once in darkness, but now we walk in his light. It is a transformation only God can make possible. So, as you go throughout this week, of course, they always encourage us to do things. So the first thing they say here is to open your eyes. Pray each morning this week that God will show you where you're not seeing things with accurate spiritual sight. Pray through the circumstances in your life, especially those that are difficult, and ask God to help you trust him for what you can't see. And then open your Bible. Commit to spending time each day reading God's Word. Search online for passages of Scripture that speak to Jesus being the light of the world. And then open your heart. There are people all around you who are spiritually blind and don't know the gospel or have the hope that you have for life and eternity. Look for opportunities this week to share with an unbelieving friend, family member, or coworker. In this session, we see a blind man who was hindered not by himself, but by the society in which he lived. Imagine how this man's entire world changed when his eyes were open and he encountered the light of the world. This man, blind from birth, had a testimony that could be said of everyone who encounters Jesus. He was once blind, but now he could see. All right, let us pray. God, thank you for this lesson, God, to remind us that you are the light of the world and that you are always there for us, God, to provide that light during dark times when we feel like we are spiritually blind, God. You are always there to provide light and to shine the way for us, God. Please be with us as we go throughout the week. Please help us to be a testimony for you, God, to those around us, to seek out those who might be spiritually blind, and to share our own experiences and help them to become part of the light as well. In your name we pray.